All right, I think folks are still trickling back in. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next keynote speaker. Felicia Marcus is an attorney who has served in leadership and management positions in both the government and nonprofit sectors. She is currently the Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Water in the West program and is an elected Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Her expertise includes issues around water supply, water rights, and water quality, in addition to energy, toxics, and land use. Felicia is also a member of the Water Policy Group, an international network of high-level water officials dedicated to assisting developing nations. She's a board member of the Western Electricity Coordinating Council and is one of the 3 U.S. members of the Joint Public Advisory Committee of the North American Commission on Environmental Cooperation. We're absolutely delighted that you can be with us today, Felicia. Take it away.
I'm really happy to be here and to join you at the start of a really important and impressive day that you're going to have. There's so many friends and even heroes of mine in this room that it's actually a little bit daunting. It is great to follow Christina. I thought she did a great job sitting in for Karen, really nicely done. But I want to say a word about Karen Ross, who I thought I was following even in her absence and in a time of serious grief. The thing about Karen Ross that's important for us all to be grateful for is that she brings enthusiasm, experience, and smarts to figuring out how to move forward on helping agriculture thrive while also honoring communities and ecosystems. She's really quite remarkable, and we're lucky to have had her as our Secretary of Agriculture through 2 administrations. I think she also deserves a badge of honor, in particular for her support of SGMA and seeing the necessity of taking some important and hard actions now in order to preserve the ability to farm for future generations. It took courage, and she and others in the agricultural community stood up to say we must do something to deserve our thanks. And so did the countless individuals working to implement that historic and complex but path-breaking law. You know, in California water, and in other states, of course, there's a high degree of rhetoric and talking point level discourse about water, and sometimes a far lower level of action. That said, at least in California and in other places, we're in action today in a way we were not just a few years ago on many water issues, and particularly on groundwater across the West. It's an area where the stakes are enormous and the challenge is just as great. The level of innovation and effort I'm seeing gives me great hope, just as some of what's happening in surface water breaks my heart, but that's another talk. So you can see why I'm happy to be here with you guys today, the doers, and the people who are helping us try to figure out how to solve these complex issues. My assigned topic for today was water challenges facing the West. Well, let me count the ways. It's not all about the weather or about climate change. It's in part about us and how we organize ourselves and how we deal with each other. The challenges are hydrological, they're geological, they're political, they're legal, they're cultural, economic, and psychological, and I'll touch on some of those just to set the context in which your work sits. There's a lot of expertise in this room about the facts, and I expect no one needs a lecture on how climate change is going to make the world of hurt we're in today look like a picnic in coming years. And I know Sharon's going to be able to give you a lot more detail about the West, both about the challenges and about various groundwater management strategies. Camyar can fill you in on lots of California specifics. So I'm going to start you off this morning with some points on these other topics as food for thought before you dive into the details. It is still baseball season, almost over. Pretty exciting stuff yesterday and the day before, even though neither of them are my teams, but I'm not bitter about that. But I'm fond of quoting Yogi Berra, who said many hilarious things that all of you can probably add to, and I encourage you to send me others. But my favorite quote of his, well, one of my 2 favorites, but one of my 2 favorite quotes of his in a context such as this is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And so that just sums up the challenge about the discourse about water, where there's so much talking about it that bears little relation to reality. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, And in practice, it takes the hard work that you all are assembled together to do, which I really appreciate. So let me just talk about a few of them. I mean, hydrology, of course. I mean, I'm restating the obvious, I think, for a lot of people. We've seen a 22-year drought on the Colorado River that has its reservoirs at the lowest point since they were filled. It's been called a mega drought and the worst drought in 500 or 1,200 years or other time frames, and it's quite daunting. In California, we're experiencing a repeat drought in California, a repeat drought that hit only a few years after its worst drought in modern history. This new one has been referred to as a hot drought because it was accompanied by extremely high temperatures. We read about that largely through the horrendous stories about seemingly unprecedented heat in the Northwest and parts of Canada, and many of us experienced bizarre heat, even in heat-prone California. Those temperatures made this drought come on differently than the last in a way that had adverse impacts far more rapidly. That higher temperature meant less snow made it to the ground, and what snow and rain did make it either evaporated back up, sublimation being a word many of us learned just in the last couple of years. What didn't evaporate back up into the atmosphere, it soaked into the ground so much that the percentage runoff from the precipitation we did get was massively less than projections based on prior experience. I mean, to the tune of 600,000 acre feet. Are all these things foreseeable? Yeah. I mean, we've been watching the Colorado River go down for 22 years. That's pretty foreseeable. But theoretically, it's all foreseeable. We've had 40 and 400-year droughts in California based on the geophysical record, and yet we don't quite see it. This wreaked havoc with our water allocations and created conditions in the second year of the drought that we didn't see until at least year 3 of the prior drought. We're also seeing an unprecedented in modern times again, modern times being the 100 and so years we've been keeping records as opposed to the thousands of years of geophysical records. We have the eons of records, I suppose we have in lake bed cores and in tree rings. But let me put the point. It means less water everywhere to replenish overdrafted groundwater basins in many places, and of course, just as in the mid-teens, it means communities running out of water who are dependent on shallow groundwater wells, hundreds of thousands of acres of fallow fields, people out of work, fish and wildlife getting hammered yet again. These conditions all vary by state and by region within states, of course, but we're in a world of hurt, and climate change will only make it worse. There's loss of snowpack, which is our largest storage reservoir, so desperately needed in much of the West, where we have variable hydrology by year, location, and season, and there's flooding and greater flooding in the spring and even more extreme flooding in wet years. And increasing temperatures wreak havoc with ecosystems. Estimates are, at least in California, that we may see the same amount of precipitation, that more will fall as rain rather than snow due to just a few degrees temperature rise Fahrenheit. We'll have more frequent and drier dries, punctuated by more extreme flooding when the precipitation does come. This is actually a weird blessing compared to the various areas of the world where the predictions are that it's just going to get more frequent and drier dries, like South Africa, or increased flooding coupled with sea level rise, like Bangladesh or Florida. This means there'll be times when we can capture at least a portion of those rains, in addition to what we can capture in normal years, and get it into our best storage option, our groundwater basins. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you all know this, which is why you're here. The only thing that can compensate for that loss of snowpack storage are our groundwater basins, which are massive in scale in California and vary, of course, even across the West, but they're sadly overdrafted to the tune of 2 million acre feet a year on average in a burst of well-intended production of food and fiber. So they're huge challenges, but there are answers: ag and urban water efficiency, recycling, stormwater capture, and even desal in appropriate circumstances in the urban context, buttoning up leaks, more coordinated operation of reservoirs and interties, and massive managed aquifer recharge, intentional versus incidental, including the great work of many of you in using advanced tools to find the right places for recharge in a race to get more in the ground in the right places more quickly when we do have surplus water. There's some high-tech and low-tech ways of figuring that out, and you're using them, using drip in the growing season, and some kind of flooding in the wet season, and finding those optimal places to do it. There's also an upper watershed connection, but that's not the topic for today, where we can't replace that snowpack, but by restoring meadows and doing ecological forest restoration, we can get a little bit of that holding the flow back timing benefit that is so essential to make water in the West actually work for people and for critters. It's an exciting area I've been spending a lot of time on. One of those areas that gives me hope, even though it's hopelessly complex, even compared to groundwater, but we're making progress. There are different ag practices, as Christina talked about, that can meet climate, water, and food production needs. It's all about multi-benefit thinking and multi-stakeholder action and collaboration, which is the human dynamic is very difficult. And we have to recognize the connection between water quality and water supply, and most importantly, prioritize the small systems for both water quality and water supply, as their wells run dry first, and then when they're not dry, they're frequently contaminated. And I want to make a nod here to the incredibly important work done by Thomas Harder and his colleagues in the early teens that highlighted this issue, which allowed that issue not only to become more in the public domain, but helped create the political will and the work that we've been able to do over the last 10 years of the human right to water, making progress in that arena. Still a long way to go, but we're definitely off the dime and in motion, and Thomas is one of the fathers of that, based on his science. Law. Let me talk about this, and this one I don't want to get too wonky about, but it's really important and a challenging area that gets in the way of doing what science might say the obvious answers are. Water rights, both surface and groundwater, vary enormously across the West and differ completely from those in the East, so it's hard to generalize. However, water rights make things complicated. You know, for one thing, the appropriative rights system makes it difficult, not impossible, to make decisions on allocations based on hydrology, and some would say equity. Equity, however, is in the eye of the beholder. To someone in an agricultural community that has relied on the appropriative system to build their farms and communities to produce food and fiber, it's inequitable to suggest impinging on their realistic expectations based on 100+ years of investment. To indigenous people that had their land taken away, their people decimated, and their treaties abridged or never signed, the fact that others were able to claim that water at that time is the deepest inequity imaginable. To small communities whose wells run dry, there are obvious equity issues. Hence, you can see some of the complexity of dealing with the historic level of drought we're seeing on the Colorado in particular. I mean, surface water rights is tough. Seniors get 100% before the next in line get any. If you're curtailed, you're cut off. It's one thing to fallow a patchwork of individual farms. It's going to be a lot harder to completely cut off a state like Arizona, which Sharon can talk about if you're interested. There have been interim agreements and workarounds for the past 6 years that are truly impressive, and longer than 6 years, but on the Colorado, the bills become due. And as Sharon can explain far better than I can when she speaks later today, the Colorado Law of the River is based heavily on water rights seniority, but not completely, and it's governed by agreements made initially 100 years ago and updated periodically, punctuated by litigation, and based on a hydrology that was overly optimistic, didn't consider evaporative losses, and certainly isn't realistic under climate change. The same is true of the California projects. And yet people cling to their seniority, their prior agreements, or their sense of equity in the eye of the beholder, as between the upper and lower basin states, and whatever's most convenient to them. I say this all not because you're going to work to resolve those issues, but that the challenges of groundwater management include this larger context, not just the math, science, geology, or engineering. There is, of course, a path that does honor historic rights while also dealing realistically with the reality of the hydrological nightmare we're experiencing, but the politics and other matters I'll talk about later make that difficult. We also have this somewhat artificial distinction, or completely artificial distinction, between surface and groundwater management in most states in the West, something that would seem wacky to someone who realizes that they were all connected once and are connected in more ways than we acknowledge now. Again, each state's different, but there's an interesting interplay between surface and groundwater rights in California, which I know best. I'll just scratch the surface, as it's a big topic, and I've talked with or worked on it with many of you over the years. I mean, We've got 4 different water rights systems, in essence, in this state. A riparian one, a pre-14 appropriative system, a post-14, post-1914 appropriative system, they're junior, and groundwater. For surface water rights, in general, a lack of data, complexity, barriers to enforcement make it murky and subject to confusion and discord. That has an impact on groundwater for many reasons. It's far less legal than practical. You know, groundwater law is correlative, largely. It's you can pump what's under your land so long as you don't impinge on somebody else's right to pump. Easier said than done, easier to quantify in your own head than in actuality. And when you hear people talk about groundwater rights, it's as if they can pump as much as they want. If you have a challenge, if you have a conflict, your only recourse before the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, known as SGMA, was to go to court. And if you went to court, it could take 30 or 40 years, and you have to pay for it. Really expensive, and counter to much of the culture in agriculture being neighborly. That's part of what I love about working with agriculture, is that culture of neighborliness, but it's a double-edged sword in some ways. And so folks either don't have the money or the political will or the comfort with calling out their neighbors, and yet, as we saw an influx of, I'm jumping ahead of myself in the interest of time, we saw an influx of outside investors, not from around here, sinking much deeper wells and liquidating an unregulated water source. I'm surprised it took so long, to plant more permanent crops. Neighbors' wells start going dry. People start seeing the water levels go down, and in a panic because the tools they had available weren't really there, which is why, and some of you have heard me say this a million times, that as I went out into the Central Valley in particular to meet with folks in agriculture and in small communities to see what they thought about all this, I literally had, people talk to me all the time, but I literally a couple times had farmers come up to me, grab my arm in a bar and say, you've got to make us do this, just don't say I told you so. And so we knew that there was support behind the scenes, even if not at a microphone, for us to do something, to be the heavy, which is interesting. So SGMA was passed in, the SGMA passage in California in 2014 means that groundwater sustainability agencies need to come up with groundwater sustainability plans that get to sustainability by 2040, but you got to start now to get there. It's not like you can have a big balloon payment down at the end of the line. And through this process, and I won't go through it in great detail, though I'm happy to explain it because I know many of you understand it in this process that I like to refer to as a collective implementation model. Folks at the local level are put in a construct or a scaffolding to have to manage that local resource amongst themselves, which creates a dynamic where you can play on the neighborly culture to get folks to do hard decisions together. But there's a scaffolding at the state level, and I'm oversimplifying it in the interest of time, where the Department of Water Resources becomes the technical expert and in some ways the frontline regulator that sets the tone, sets the rules, and reviews the plans, and plays the umpire calling balls and strikes, to follow with the baseball metaphor, as to whether you've done it well enough. And it's set up as an iterative process where it's not one and done. It's you have time to cure. Why? Because of an understanding of the politics and the political culture where folks needed that backstop, that scaffolding of the federal government to be able to go back to their neighbors and make some really hard decisions. So it's not as surprising to me that so many were dinged. It's a pleasure to see DWR standing up and doing that. If they didn't, it would fall apart. And then if you don't do it after multiple hearings and multiple chances to cure, the big, bad, dreaded water board or 800-pound gorilla will do it to you, and nobody wants that. The water board doesn't want that. And so it's a construct that allows people to rise to the occasion, but one that is incredibly complicated in terms of data and really hard local decisions. And Stephanie can tell you later about what it feels like to be in that vortex. And those people are going to deserve Purple Hearts, badges of honor, or whatever it is, the ones I know, who are doing amazing things. And Sarge can tell you about a ton of them, where there are amazing things happening by people who took that scaffolding and are running with it, even as there are other people who are wringing their hands. Okay, I just jumped through the whole SGMA 101. I'm probably not that useful to people who don't know it in general, but it's going to be tough because implementing it, the estimates run 500,000 million, 1,500,000 acres will come out of production. Now, to people who talk about that in terms of percentage of the economy or across the board as an average, that doesn't seem like, it feels like a contraction to deal with the overextension, the exuberance of food and fiber, but that's not going to be felt equally. There are going to be communities who are really potentially going to be devastated. And it's good to see that some people are stepping up across the traditional divides to help, but we all need to focus on the smartest ways to do research, even recharge, even as we do demand management. I mean, it'll sort out, but it's going to be messy, and SGMA is going to make a huge difference in preserving the ability to farm for our children, our grandchildren, but it's not only illuminated our hydrological and geological issues, but also the failings and shortcomings of our inadequately built out legal system. And you see it as people squabble over surface flows they now need a water rights for in order to get it into the ground. So, and Lois has done an amazing job of telling these stories. If you don't subscribe to San Joaquin Valley Water, you should. It's really the only place you can hear the stories and see the challenges that people are struggling with. And it's an amazing thing to watch, which better writers than I will write about as a historic epoch in California water. Moving more quickly, there's cultural issues too, and I've talked about a few of them. Make it all challenging, can't list them all, a few thoughts. In this world, having spent time with all of them, being sort of a person in the middle and more of a social worker or anthropologist than a lawyer by personality, you know, everybody feels like a victim. People will feel victimized and deal with that. I call it the sanctimonious victim syndrome. When I'm mad at somebody, it's just a human feeling when I'm being compassionate, which is most of the time, I think, but not all of the time. And everyone has pride in what they do or where they come from. Ag feels really oppressed by urbans, or in California, the coastal elite. They feel and hate being called polluters or fish killers, as if they come to work to pollute or kill a fish, rather than growing the food that we all eat that has some externalities and negative factors. But they're doing something quite noble. They fear that urban needs are going to lead to their water being taken away, or their neighbors selling so much water for the dollars urbans will be able to pay that the communities will become ghost towns. This fight is happening all over Colorado and Arizona in particular right now. It's headlines virtually every week. They're skeptical of government regulation and even more resistant to sharing information with the government, which is in part why SGMA is organized the way it is around this collective implementation model. If we had just done it top down in the way many brainiacs had suggested we did, it wouldn't have passed, for one thing. But even if it had passed, we would have been spending 10 years litigating against the man rather than the energy that's been turned towards trying to solve this really difficult project locally. EJ communities feel totally left behind, as Christina was talking about, in some cases being comprised of the people who grow our food, but see pristine surface water go by them, to which fertilizers and chemicals are added to water the fields they work in, but pollute the groundwater upon which their own shallow wells rely. They also see those wells run dry as larger agricultural concerns sink deeper wells and more powerful pumps. Other times that issue is compounded by historic efforts to separate them from pre-existing communities through lack of service or connection to the larger water supply system. Indigenous communities, as I said, see their lifeways destroyed as their cultural and subsistence fisheries are decimated, ditto the fishing industry, by our over-depletion of surface waters and over-pumping of groundwater basins that deplete surface waters too. Environmentalists feel they've lost the war over the ecosystem and no one's listening. There are fights and replays of the same fights across the decades, but there are also historic efforts to help reach across the divides, with environmentalists helping GSAs make the transition to different, lower water-intensive businesses, getting state dollars to help with land repurposing to lessen the blow of those acres going out of production over the coming years. But the divisions between silos are still strong and getting in the way. If you haven't already seen it, you will. Finally, there is such a history of whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting that's hard even for those who want to reach across the aisle to do so. And I have the scars to prove it by folks in the environmental community being mad that I was defending agriculture against stupid attacks on agriculture during the drought, including asking my husband at some party, this is one of many examples, what's with Felicia? Why is she defending ag? And he just looked and said, well, why shouldn't she? defend ag. She eats, agriculture's important. It's not an us-them. It's not a total divide. And I frequently would say that somebody in LA has more in common with the farmer who grows his or her food than with the jerk down the block that's overwatering their lawn. So we need to figure out a way to make those connections more real for people, because these cultural things have force and power and bleed into politics and policy. Faster now. On psychology, I just have to mention it. Man, I'm no expert here, but that victim mentality is stronger than an opportunity mentality, and there's research to prove that. So you learn this as a lawyer in negotiating theory. Fear of loss, much bigger than hope of opportunity in negotiations. Fighting's easier than collaborating, that's for sure. Trusting those from your community and adopting and believing what's convenient, either in terms of water cooler talking points about how everything is somebody else's fault, either a fish or a bureaucrat or another water user, must have a Merck manual diagnostic code. It's so common. And this issue of folks fearing loss more than they reach for opportunities in the future, you see it happening in the political world around us. This isn't the first time it's been this fractious, but this is pretty bad. But there's data to prove it. I mean, just watch how political ads work, and you'll see it all around you. That's based on data and research. It's not just that political consultants are mean. They are, a lot of the time. It's a cultural norm. But it's also based on data and research. Economics, just going to say the fixes are expensive. Either conventional infrastructure or green infrastructure, which is beneficial but more complex. The cost of doing managed aquifer recharge, though, transitioning land, dealing with contamination is expensive, but the value of doing so now, down the line, will be priceless. And this is hard to convey in traditional economic analysis that looks at dollar per acre foot or even net present value. The thing we need to be looking at is what's the cost in the future to the economy as a whole of disruption or the water not being there. And we don't have as much of that as we need to. Is there any economists in the room? We need a lot more of that in this arena. And LA is funding a study in part to justify their massive investment in the largest recycling project in the world on what will be the avoided cost of disruption in 20 years of having spent the money now. And the equities there are obvious when you think about the risk to imported water in Southern California. And finally, politics. You know, I moved politics up and down in this list. I started with it in the front, and I did it in some ways because I think politics is part of the problem, and in other ways because, frankly, political leaders are better at following than leading in general, and at water in particular. I say this as someone who's worked in a lot of arenas, even more than were mentioned before. They all have their cultures and their hot buttons. You know, in air, it's geopolitical and very cerebral. Toxics is fear and anger. And water is, well, let me count the ways again, is very emotional and requires the same thing being said over and over and over again in ways that are mysterious. Having been in the water world and then left for 7 years, I came back in. It was the same people having the same talking points, passing each other in parallel play, which, mind you, is a 7-year-old level of evolution in child psychology under Piaget's work. And it's just different in water. It's much tougher. It's much more touchy. It's much more groupthink, but also a challenge for people who want to blame somebody else rather than work together to solve a problem. Even though all these people are really nice, they're all my friends. That's why I kept getting those jobs, because I got along with all those people. It's a little bit of lore that I don't, but in practice, folks know. In ag in particular, which has been sort of my biggest support group since I left the water board, which is nice, of course, that people actually, it's a Sally Field kind of moment. People really appreciate it. But it's really, really difficult, and water is particularly fraught with lore over facts, with faith-based representation and perceptions of what's happening, and in many places a seemingly fact-free zone, particularly in California. Colorado, it's opposite day, because they have quantified everything down, it's seemingly to the micron, but they have their own issues and their own really weird arguments because of how much they've quantified it, and that's also a story for another day. But because of that lack of fact-based data in many places being transparent and available, folks can make stuff up. And really good folks can truly believe it. What that does is it gives license to the lawyers, lobbyists, and politicians that thrive on the discord and gives them an unusually good opportunity to emphasize and exacerbate differences between water users and stakeholders, other stakeholders, and to use the familiar political trope of blaming others, be they a fish, a bureaucrat, or another water user. Urban ag, fish farmer, north-south, big ag, little ag, east slope, west slope, delta, exporters, whatever. And it's particularly painful and a total waste of time and human energy arguing about talking points and mythology versus having a stable and transparent foundation upon which to argue about the real issues and challenges, which are hard enough. Politicians at a state level, even if they know the facts versus the rhetoric, fall captive to whichever group their political advisors feel will be more advantageous to them in a future election. That's the way it works, unless you have political will and the public clearly feels about something in the media, then politicians will pay attention. And there are some who have really done it. Jerry Brown, using his political chips to get Sigma passed. Bill Clinton, who in that administration, I'm biased from being part of it, where our direction was to work with everybody and to try and solve problems. And Bruce Babbitt was sort of the rock star of that in getting agreements made and thinking differently across the transom. But man, it was exhausting because we met with everybody all the time. Not backroom, not shuttle diplomacy. We had the off-the-record one-on-ones. I did tell the governor when he interviewed me for the water board job that I drank more alcohol on behalf of the environment than anybody knew, because it felt like you have a public conversation, and you need to have those one-on-ones of coffee or a glass of wine or whiskey, whatever works, and then makes the difference. But in any event, it brings me back to you and my conclusion, and it's why I'm so happy to be here with you. You are embarking on the most important work possible to bring light into the murkiness of groundwater, to, in the words of the UN Waters theme this year, to make the invisible visible. You've brought together stellar scientists and policy experts across the West to illuminate issues so we can not only talk about groundwater more effectively, but so that we can actually take the really hard actions that need to be taken if we're to deal with that freight train of pain that climate change is bringing to the water-scarce Western U.S. What we need to do that is a long list, the data and science, but also creativity to lay a foundation for more rational conversation at that policy and political level, and to do the work on the ground that so many people are trying to do in their own regions. You're going to hear a lot of good news and encouraging work today from people working not only on the challenging arena of recharge in terms of quantity, location, and methodology, but on the very important water quality and supply issues that are brought into play. Focusing on accomplishments today is important. I love this agenda since we have such a long and winding and challenging road ahead, and I really liked it. With the great cast of partners and experts you have in this project, I know you'll address the challenges even as you acknowledge the accomplishments, and you will help and inspire others to be able to rise to the occasion. So replenish your spirits today to better replenish the basins tomorrow. Thanks for having me.